Welcome to Dreamscribe, your companion on the journey to peaceful sleep. Before you drift off, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps this calming community grow. Where in the world are you tuning in from? The auction yard buzzed with energy, a mix of eager bidders and casual spectators milling about among rows of second-hand vehicles. Sarah adjusted her sunglasses, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the asphalt. She nudged Jason, her boyfriend, who was studying a glossy pamphlet listing the day's offerings. "This one looks promising," Jason said, pointing to a small photo of an RV. "It's in our budget, and it doesn't look half bad." Sarah peered at the picture skeptically. "It's old," she said, "and cheap. There's probably a reason for that." Jason grinned. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure? This could be our ticket to that cross-country trip we've always talked about." Sarah sighed, her resolve softening. They had been saving for months, and the idea of hitting the open road was tempting. "Fine," she said, "but let's check it out first." The RV sat at the edge of the lot, its once bright paint dulled by years of wear. The windows were slightly tinted, and the chrome trim gleamed faintly in the sunlight. Jason ran his hand along its side, inspecting the dents and scratches. "It's got character," he said, trying to sound optimistic. Sarah opened the door, the faint smell of mildew wafting out to greet her. The interior was surprisingly well preserved, retro-patterned upholstery, a small kitchenette, and a fold-out bed. It had an odd charm, but something about it made her uneasy. "Feels old," she murmured, stepping inside. Jason ignored her hesitation, already picturing the trips they could take. "It just needs a little TLC," he said, flipping switches and testing cabinets. "This is perfect." The auctioneer, a grizzled man with a weathered face, approached them as they explored. "Thinking of bidding on this one?" he asked, his voice raspy. Jason nodded. "Yeah, it seems like a good deal." The auctioneer's smile faltered slightly. "It's yours if you want it," he said, "but I'll tell you what I tell everyone who asks about it. This RV's got a history." Sarah frowned. "What kind of history?" The man shrugged. "People say it's cursed. Weird things happen. Owners don't keep it long." Jason laughed nervously. "You mean it's haunted?" The auctioneer's eyes darkened. "Call it what you want. Just be careful." As he walked away, Sarah turned to Jason, her expression uneasy. "We should pass on this," she said. "There's something off about it." Jason shook his head. "It's just a story to scare people off. Besides, we can't afford to be picky." The bidding was over quickly. Few people seemed interested in the RV, and Jason won it for a price so low that even Sarah had to admit it was a steal. As they signed the paperwork, the auctioneer handed them the keys with a somber expression. "Good luck," he said, his voice tinged with something that sounded like pity. Jason pocketed the keys, grinning. "We'll be fine," he said confidently. "It's just an old RV." But as they climbed inside and the engine roared to life, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were making a mistake. The RV handled better than expected, its engine humming steadily as they left the auction yard. Jason was thrilled, adjusting to the oversized steering wheel with ease. Sarah, however, sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her eyes scanning the dashboard. "Does the speedometer look off to you?" she asked, frowning at the needle, which wavered slightly even though they were driving at a constant speed. Jason shrugged. "Probably just needs recalibrating. Nothing serious." The radio crackled suddenly, static filling the cabin before a faint, distorted voice broke through. "Turn back," it said, barely audible. Sarah's breath hitched. "Did you hear that?" Jason fiddled with the dial, dismissing it as interference. "It's an old radio," he said, "probably picking up a weak signal." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She stared at the radio, her unease growing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jason reached for the GPS. "Let's find a campground," he said, punching in their location. The screen flickered, the route recalibrating on its own. A new destination appeared. Rest stop, 6 miles ahead. Sarah frowned. "I didn't think there was a rest stop around here." Jason glanced at the screen, shrugging. "It's probably a shortcut. Let's check it out." The road narrowed as they drove, the surrounding forest growing denser. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and the occasional road sign. Sarah's unease deepened with every mile. "This doesn't feel right," she said, gripping the armrest. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Jason opened his mouth to reply, but the RV suddenly jolted, the engine revving on its own. The steering wheel resisted his grip, turning sharply as though guided by an unseen force. "What the hell?" Jason shouted, fighting for control. The RV sped up, its headlights illuminating a small, decrepit rest stop ahead. The RV came to an abrupt stop, its engine shutting off as if on command. Jason and Sarah exchanged nervous glances before stepping outside. The rest stop was eerily quiet, its single lamppost flickering weakly. Graffiti covered the walls of the restroom building, and an old payphone dangled from its cord. A faint breeze rustled the leaves, but otherwise, the world felt unnaturally still. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered. "Let's leave." Jason nodded, but as he reached for the door handle, it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he said, his voice tight. He tried the key, but it wouldn't turn. Sarah's heart raced. "Jason, look," she said, pointing to the RV's dashboard. The GPS screen was on, displaying a new message: "Stay." Jason's face paled. "We're not staying," he said, pulling harder at the door. But the RV wouldn't budge. As they stood outside, the lamppost flickered and went out, plunging the rest stop into darkness. The sound of the engine idling returned, even though the key wasn't in the ignition. The RV's headlights flared, illuminating the forest beyond. In the distance, shadowy figures began to emerge, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. They moved slowly, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Jason," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "What is this?" He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the RV, where the radio had come to life again. Static filled the air, followed by the same distorted voice. "It's only the beginning." The rest stop was silent except for the faint creak of the RV's cooling engine. Sarah stood frozen next to the vehicle, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as the chill of the night settled in. The flickering lamppost had died completely, and now only the pale glow of the RV's headlights illuminated the desolate surroundings. Jason paced near the RV's door, his jaw clenched as he tried the handle for the third time. "Still locked," he muttered, his voice tight with frustration. "This makes no sense." Sarah turned her gaze to the rest stop's dilapidated structure. The graffiti-covered walls and shattered windows made the building seem like a relic from another time. Weeds sprouted through cracks in the concrete, and the payphone dangled lifelessly, its receiver swinging faintly in the breeze. "It's like this place was abandoned decades ago," Sarah said. "Why would the GPS send us here?" Jason shook his head, glancing toward the glowing GPS screen still displaying the single word, "Stay." The unease in his chest grew heavier. "I don't know," he replied, "but I don't think it's a glitch anymore." As they cautiously explored the area, Sarah's unease deepened. The ground around the rest stop was littered with scraps of metal and discarded items, all rusted and broken. An old, overturned trash can spilled out its contents: yellowed newspaper clippings, faded wrappers, and a child's toy car, its paint chipped and dull. Sarah knelt to pick up one of the clippings. The headline sent a chill down her spine. "Vanishing travelers spark local mystery." The article described a series of disappearances near this very highway, all linked to sightings of a strange vehicle. The details were vague, but the date caught her attention. "Jason," she called, holding up the clipping. "This is from the 1980s. Jason joined her, frowning as he read over her shoulder. "What does that have to do with us?" Sarah pointed to a faded black and white photo accompanying the article. In the background, barely visible, was a vehicle that looked eerily similar to their RV. "What if it's this?" she whispered. "What if it's been here before?" Jason reluctantly agreed to check inside the building. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty space. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight, which barely illuminated the darkened corners. The interior was as derelict as the exterior. A few broken chairs were scattered around, and the floor was littered with crumpled paper and shattered glass. A vending machine, its front panel smashed, stood in the corner, its shelves empty. Sarah's flashlight landed on a bulletin board near the back wall. Pinned to it were dozens of Polaroid photos, their edges curling with age. She stepped closer, her breath catching as she realized what she was looking at. The photos depicted various vehicles, cars, trucks, and RVs, parked in the same lot they were standing in now. In some of the images, faint figures could be seen inside the vehicles, their faces blurred or obscured. "This is creepy," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would these be here?" Jason didn't answer. He was staring at one photo in particular. It showed a vehicle identical to theirs, its headlights glowing faintly in the darkness. "That's our RV," he said, his voice shaking. "It's been here before." When they returned to the RV, the air inside felt different, colder, heavier. Sarah's stomach churned as she noticed subtle changes. A small crack in the dashboard that hadn't been there before, the faint smell of burnt rubber hanging in the air. Jason sat in the driver's seat, staring at the GPS. The screen no longer displayed "stay." Instead, a new set of coordinates had appeared, accompanied by a flashing message. "Follow or suffer." "Great," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Now it's threatening us." Sarah sank into the passenger seat, clutching the newspaper clipping. "What does it want? Why is it doing this?" Jason shook his head. "I don't know, but if we don't figure it out soon," he trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. They decided to spend the night in the RV, locking the doors and pulling the curtains closed. Sarah curled up on the fold-out bed, her eyes darting toward the darkened windows every few minutes. Jason sat at the small table, flipping through the photos they'd taken from the rest stop. The hum of the RV's engine filled the cabin, though neither of them had turned it on. Jason rose to investigate, opening the driver's side door to check the ignition. As soon as he stepped outside, the door slammed shut behind him, locking automatically. "Jason!" Sarah shouted, scrambling to unlock the door from the inside. It wouldn't budge. Jason pounded on the window, his breath fogging the glass. "Something's out here," he said, his voice muffled but panicked. "I saw something move." Sarah's heart raced as she glanced toward the GPS. The screen had gone dark, replaced by a single, faint reflection of herself, except the reflection was smiling. Jason eventually managed to get back inside, his face pale and his hands trembling. "I don't know what's happening," he said, "but we need to figure it out." Sarah pointed to the reflection on the GPS screen. "Look," she said, "that's not me. It's something else." Jason leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. The smile on the reflection widened unnaturally, and the screen flickered before going dark. The sound of footsteps echoed outside, followed by a faint tapping on the RV's back window. Sarah and Jason froze, their breaths shallow. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like someone, or something, was pounding on the walls. "What do they want?" Sarah whispered. Jason didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the dashboard, where a new message had appeared. "The road is calling." Sarah turned to Jason, her voice shaking. "What if we don't follow it? What happens then?" Jason's jaw tightened. "I don't think we want to find out." The engine roared to life on its own, and the RV began to move, its headlights cutting through the fog. Sarah and Jason exchanged a terrified glance, realizing they were no longer in control. As the RV accelerated down the desolate road, Sarah clutched Jason's hand. "What if we're being led to something worse?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Jason swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Then we'll find out soon enough." The RV barreled down the winding road, its engine roaring with a power that didn't match its age. Jason gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, as the headlights cut through the dense fog. Beside him, Sarah sat frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The realization that they were no longer in control of the vehicle was sinking in fast. "Jason, slow down!" Sarah shouted, her voice laced with panic. "I can't!" Jason yelled back, struggling to fight the wheel as it seemed to steer itself. "It's not responding." The GPS on the dashboard blinked erratically, its screen displaying a series of flashing coordinates that changed faster than they could read. A distorted voice crackled through the radio, faint and barely audible. "Keep going, keep going." "What does it want from us?" Sarah whispered, clutching the armrest tightly. Jason didn't answer. His eyes were glued to the road as it twisted and turned, the RV moving with an unsettling precision. The vehicle seemed to anticipate every curve, every bend, as though it had driven this route 1,000 times before. The first sign that something was truly wrong came when the road began to change. The smooth asphalt gave way to cracked, uneven pavement, and the trees lining the highway grew denser, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The RV's headlights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the landscape. "Where are we?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Jason shook his head. "I don't know. The GPS doesn't make any sense. None of this does." The radio crackled again, and this time the voice was clearer, closer now, almost there. Sarah leaned forward, staring at the GPS. The screen had stopped flashing and now displayed a single word: home. A familiar structure loomed ahead, its silhouette emerging from the fog like a specter. Sarah gasped, her stomach twisting in fear. "That's the rest stop," she said. "We've been here before." Jason's grip on the wheel tightened. "That's not possible. We've been driving for hours." The RV slowed on its own, pulling into the same cracked lot where they had parked earlier. The engine shut off with a shudder, and the headlights dimmed, leaving them in an oppressive silence. The air was heavy, and the faint hum of electricity buzzed in the background. Jason and Sarah exchanged a glance, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. "It's like it's leading us," Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Leading us where?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. She glanced out the window, her breath catching as she spotted movement in the shadows. Figures were gathering at the edge of the lot, their outlines flickering like static on an old television. The shadows moved closer, their glowing eyes fixed on the RV. Jason scrambled to lock the doors, his heart racing as the first figure reached the vehicle. Its hand, if it could be called that, pressed against the window, leaving a dark, oily smear. "What do they want?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. Jason shook his head, unable to tear his gaze away from the figures. "I don't know, but we're not sticking around to find out." He turned the key, but the engine didn't respond. Instead, the dashboard lights flickered, and the radio sprang to life again. The same distorted voice echoed through the cabin. "You can't leave." "Not yet." Sarah covered her ears, trying to block out the sound. The voice was low and guttural, filled with a malice that made her skin crawl. "Jason, make it stop," she cried. "I'm trying," he shouted, slamming his fist against the dashboard. The radio crackled, the voice cutting in and out like a bad signal. "The truth, the engine. Find it?" Jason and Sarah turned to each other, their fear momentarily replaced by confusion. "The engine," Jason repeated. "What does that mean?" Sarah's eyes widened as a thought struck her. "The journal," she said. "The one we found in the compartment. Maybe it has answers." Jason grabbed the journal from the dashboard, flipping through its brittle pages. The entries were scattered and disjointed, written in a frantic scrawl that was hard to read. One passage caught his attention. "The engine is the heart. It remembers. It hungers. It will take you where you fear to go." Sarah's breath hitched. "The engine is alive?" Jason looked at her, his face pale. "If this thing is controlling the RV, then maybe we need to confront it. Shut it down somehow." The two of them hesitated before stepping out of the cabin. The air outside was colder than before, biting against their skin. The shadows had stopped moving, their glowing eyes fixed on the RV as though waiting for something. Jason grabbed a flashlight and led the way to the front of the vehicle. Popping the hood, he shone the light into the engine compartment. What he saw made his blood run cold. The engine was unlike anything he had ever seen. It pulsed faintly, almost like it was alive and strange. Vein-like wires snaked across its surface. The oily substance from the shadows dripped from its edges, pooling beneath the RV. "This isn't normal," Jason said, his voice shaking. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, her stomach churning at the sight. "What do we do?" she asked. Jason didn't answer. He reached for a wrench, his hand trembling as he prepared to disconnect the cables. But as he touched the first wire, a shock surged through his body, throwing him backward. The shadows surged forward as Jason hit the ground, their forms solidifying as they surrounded the RV. Sarah screamed, dragging him back toward the door. "Get inside," she shouted. The RV roared to life again, its headlights blazing as the engine growled like a wild animal. The dashboard inside lit up, displaying a single chilling message: "It's too late." Jason and Sarah clambered inside, slamming the door shut as the shadows began pounding against the windows. The vehicle lurched forward on its own, tearing out of the lot and back onto the highway. Sarah flipped through the journal, her eyes scanning the frantic entries. "There has to be a way to stop this," she said, her voice frantic. "There's always a way." Jason glanced at her, his hands gripping the wheel even though it wasn't responding to him. "Hurry up," he said. "We're running out of time." Finally, Sarah found a passage that made her heart sink. "The engine can be silenced, but only through fire. The price is high. Be ready to pay." She looked at Jason, her voice trembling. "It wants us to destroy it. But we might not survive." Jason nodded grimly. "If that's what it takes to end this, we'll do it." As the RV barreled toward an unknown destination, Sarah held the journal tightly, her mind racing. "What if it's lying?" she asked. "What if destroying the engine doesn't stop it?" Jason's jaw tightened. "Then we'll make sure it never takes anyone else," he said. "No matter what it costs." The vehicle shuddered violently, the radio crackling with static as the voice returned. "Choose wisely, or not at all." The RV careened down the desolate road, the steering wheel moving on its own as Jason and Sarah clung to their seats. The air inside the cabin was thick, oppressive, as if the vehicle itself were alive and angry. The dashboard lights flickered erratically, casting ominous shadows across their terrified faces. Sarah gripped the journal tightly, her eyes scanning the chaotic scrawl of its final entries. Jason, it says here the engine isn't just a machine. It's something else. Something alive. Jason shot her a glance, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. What do you mean alive? It's metal and wires. No, listen, Sarah said, her voice trembling. The previous owner wrote that the engine has a spirit tied to it, a malevolent force. He called it the heart of the damned. It's why the RV is doing this. Jason's jaw tightened as the RV made another sharp, unprompted turn, nearly sending them into a ditch. Great. So how do we stop it? Sarah's fingers traced a passage in the journal. It says the engine needs to be severed from its power source. That's the only way to destroy it. But, Jason, the power source isn't just mechanical. It's feeding on something else. Jason exhaled sharply. Feeding on what? Sarah swallowed hard. Fear. Pain. Despair. The RV slowed on its own as a structure appeared ahead in the headlights, a decrepit factory, its silhouette jagged against the night sky. The air seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy, and a faint, rhythmic hum emanated from the building. Sarah shuddered. Why is it bringing us here? Jason's eyes narrowed. I don't know, but if this place has answers, we're going to find them. The RV parked itself directly in front of the factory's massive, rusted doors. The engine shut off, plunging them into an unsettling silence. The dashboard displayed a single message, enter. Jason grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar, while Sarah clutched the journal. Together, they stepped out into the cold night. The factory loomed over them, its windows shattered and its walls covered in peeling paint and cryptic graffiti. The interior was cavernous and dark, the faint glow of their flashlight beams barely penetrating the shadows. Rusted machinery lined the walls, and the air smelled of oil and decay. Their footsteps echoed loudly, amplifying the eerie stillness. In the center of the room stood a massive machine, a hulking, grotesque version of the RV's engine. It pulsed faintly as if breathing, and its tangled wires stretched out like veins, snaking across the floor and walls. Sarah pointed to the machine, her voice barely above a whisper. That's it. That's the source. Jason approached cautiously, his flashlight trembling in his hand. It's connected to the RV. This thing, it's controlling everything. As they examined the machine, Sarah flipped through the journal, piecing together the scattered entries. The original owner must have built this, she said. He wrote about experimenting with the RV, trying to harness energy from something. He called it the void. Jason frowned. The void? What does that even mean? It's not clear, Sarah replied, flipping to the last page. But whatever it is, he opened a door he couldn't close. He tied the RV to this engine, and it became a conduit for whatever came through. Jason's grip on the crowbar tightened. So we destroy the engine, right? That's how we stop this. Sarah hesitated. It's not that simple. The journal says the engine won't die unless the connection is severed first. We have to break the bond between the RV and this thing. Before they could act, the factory filled with the sound of whispers, low and guttural, growing louder with each passing second. Sarah spun around, her flashlight landing on the shadows that had followed them. They slithered into the room, their glowing eyes fixed on the couple. They're protecting it, Jason said, raising the crowbar. They don't want us to stop it. The shadows surged forward, their forms flickering like static. Jason swung the crowbar, but it passed through the figures as if they were smoke. Sarah screamed as one of the shadows lunged at her, its icy tendrils grazing her arm. Jason, she cried. We need to hurry. Jason ran to the machine, using the crowbar to pry open a panel. Inside, a network of pulsating wires glowed faintly, their movements eerily organic. He hesitated for a moment before yanking one loose. The machine groaned, and the shadows let out an ear-piercing wail. The floor trembled beneath their feet as the engine's pulse slowed. It's working, Sarah shouted, clutching the journal. Keep going. Jason pulled another wire, then another, each one met with a violent shudder from the machine. The shadows grew more aggressive, their forms solidifying as they clawed at the couple. Sarah flipped to the journal's final page. It says there's one more connection, she said. The core. You have to destroy the core. Jason located the core, a glowing, spherical object encased in glass at the heart of the machine. It pulsed rhythmically, emitting a faint, otherworldly hum. How do I destroy it? Jason yelled. Sarah scanned the journal frantically. It says fire. You have to burn it. Jason glanced around, spotting an old canister of fuel nearby. He doused the core, the liquid splashing over the wires and pooling at the base. With shaking hands, he pulled a lighter from his pocket and flicked it on. Jason, hurry! Sarah screamed as the shadows closed in. He threw the lighter onto the core. The flames erupted instantly, consuming the machine in a fiery blaze. The core shattered, and the engine let out a deafening roar before falling silent. The shadows froze, their forms flickering violently before disintegrating into ash. The factory trembled as the remaining machinery collapsed, sparks flying as wires snapped and panels burst into flames. "Run!" Jason shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand. They sprinted out of the factory as the structure began to implode, debris raining down around them. The RV sat waiting outside, its headlights dim but steady. Jason and Sarah climbed inside, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The engine started on its own, but this time, the hum was soft, almost soothing. The dashboard displayed a single word: free. As the RV drove them away from the burning factory, Sarah clutched the journal tightly. "Do you think it's over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason glanced at the rearview mirror, watching the factory disappear into the distance. "I don't know," he said, "but we stopped whatever that thing was. That has to mean something." Sarah nodded, though doubt lingered in her eyes. The RV's interior felt lighter, less oppressive, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't right. Hours later, as they pulled into a rest area to regroup, Sarah noticed a faint glow on the dashboard. She leaned closer, her heart sinking as a new message appeared: "Not yet." The RV screeched to a halt just outside the collapsing factory, its headlights dimming momentarily before returning to full brightness. Inside, Jason and Sarah sat in tense silence, their breaths ragged. The dashboard screen flickered once, displaying the single word: run. Jason's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "It's not over," he said, his voice low. Sarah clutched the journal tightly, her knuckles white. "We destroyed the core. We broke the connection. What else could it want?" The answer came almost immediately. The RV's engine roared to life on its own, the vibrations rattling the cabin. The vehicle jolted forward, pulling itself back onto the road, even as Jason's foot slammed down on the brake. "I can't stop it," Jason shouted, his eyes wide with panic. Sarah's gaze flicked to the GPS. A new destination had appeared on the screen, accompanied by a single, ominous message: final test. The RV hurtled down the dark highway, the landscape outside twisting and warping as though reality itself were unraveling. The trees along the roadside seemed to lean in closer, their branches clawing at the windows. The air inside the cabin grew heavier with each passing second, making it hard to breathe. Sarah flipped through the journal frantically, her hands trembling. "There has to be something else in here," she muttered. "Something we missed." Jason glanced at her, his jaw clenched. "We don't have time for research, Sarah. Whatever this thing wants, it's taking us there, whether we like it or not." The radio crackled to life, static filling the cabin before a distorted voice broke through. "Prove your worth." "What does that mean?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Jason didn't answer. His attention was fixed on the road ahead, where a strange glow appeared on the horizon. It pulsed rhythmically, growing brighter with every mile they traveled. The RV approached a massive, crumbling bridge that stretched across a chasm, so deep its bottom was obscured by swirling fog. The glow emanated from the center of the bridge, where a strange, pulsating orb hovered, crackling with energy. The RV slowed on its own, coming to a stop just before the bridge's entrance. Jason and Sarah exchanged a glance. "Do we have a choice?" she asked, her voice shaking. Jason shook his head. "Not unless we want to sit here and wait for whatever's behind us to catch up." They stepped out of the RV, the air thick with electricity. The orb's glow cast long, shifting shadows across the bridge, making the already unstable structure seem even more precarious. As they approached the orb, a low hum filled the air, growing louder with each step. The journal in Sarah's hands began to vibrate, the pages flipping wildly until it settled on a single passage. The engine tests its masters. Sacrifice and resolve are the keys to freedom. "What does that mean?" Jason asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Sarah shook her head. "I don't know, but I don't think it's good." The orb flared brightly as they stepped closer, and a deafening roar filled the air. The bridge shook violently, chunks of concrete breaking away and plummeting into the fog below. Jason grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back as the orb began to pulse faster. From the glow, figures began to emerge, twisted, shadowy forms that resembled people but moved unnaturally. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their mouths stretched into wide, unnatural grins. Jason raised the crowbar, his hands trembling. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. The figures lunged forward, their movements erratic and jerky. Jason swung the crowbar, the metal passing through the first shadow without resistance. It let out a distorted scream before dissipating into wisps of smoke. "They're testing us," Sarah shouted. "We have to pass, or we're not getting out of here." The orb's hum shifted, transforming into a low, guttural voice that echoed across the bridge. "Prove your strength. Prove your resolve." Jason and Sarah froze as two smaller orbs appeared on either side of the main one. Each projected an image. On the left, a vision of the RV driving away, safe and sound. On the right, a vision of the factory, still burning, with the shadows inside screaming for release. The voice returned, more insistent this time. "Choose." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "It's giving us a choice," she said. "We can save ourselves, or we can destroy it completely." Jason stared at the visions, his mind racing. "If we destroy it, we might not survive," he said. "But if we leave it behind, it'll just keep doing this," Sarah finished. "To someone else." Jason gritted his teeth, his decision made. "We end this," he said, his voice resolute. He stepped toward the right orb, his hand outstretched. "Wait!" Sarah cried, grabbing his arm. "If we destroy it, it might take us with it." Jason looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. "Then at least we'll know it won't hurt anyone else." He plunged his hand into the orb. A searing pain shot through his body as the light enveloped him. The bridge began to collapse, the shadows wailing as they dissolved into the void. Sarah screamed, reaching for Jason as the light consumed them both. When the light faded, they were back in the RV, the engine humming softly. The dashboard displayed a new message: "You are free." Jason slumped in the driver's seat, his breathing ragged. Did we do it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I think so." The RV's headlights flickered once before stabilizing, and the oppressive atmosphere that had haunted them since the beginning lifted. The road ahead stretched endlessly, but for the first time, it felt like they were in control. As they drove away, the factory and the bridge disappeared in the rearview mirror. Sarah leaned back in her seat, the journal resting in her lap. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked softly. Jason glanced at her, his expression weary but hopeful. "I don't know," he admitted. "But for now, we're alive. That's enough." Unnoticed by either of them, the GPS screen flickered once, displaying a faint message before going dark. "We will meet again." The road stretched ahead in endless quiet, the hum of the RV's engine a low, steady rhythm that was almost soothing. Jason gripped the wheel loosely, exhaustion etched into his face, while Sarah sat in the passenger seat, the journal resting unopened in her lap. The oppressive weight that had clung to them since they first drove the RV was gone, replaced by an eerie calm that neither dared to trust. "We did it," Sarah whispered, breaking the silence. Her voice sounded hollow, like she didn't entirely believe her own words. Jason nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Yeah," he said, though the doubt lingered in his tone. "We're still here. That has to mean something." But even as he spoke, the faint echo of the orb's final hum reverberated in the back of his mind. The memory of its blinding light, the screams of the shadows, and the gut-wrenching decision to destroy it haunted him. The RV's interior felt lighter, as though the malevolence that had suffused it had been lifted. But as Sarah glanced around, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The faint scent of burnt rubber still lingered, and the crack in the dashboard had deepened, a thin, jagged line that seemed to pulse faintly under her gaze. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Jason glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "Feel what?" She hesitated, her eyes drifting to the rearview mirror. For a split second, she thought she saw a shadow flicker across the back window, but when she blinked, it was gone. "Nothing," she said, though her unease grew. As dawn broke, the faint light of a roadside diner appeared on the horizon. The sign flickered weakly, its neon letters spelling out Rest Haven Cafe. Jason pulled the RV into the empty parking lot, the tires crunching over loose gravel. "We should eat," he said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "Get our bearings before we keep going." Sarah nodded, though her eyes lingered on the diner's windows. They were dark and reflective, offering no hint of what lay inside. She grabbed the journal and followed Jason out of the RV, the air outside crisp and cool. Inside, the diner was eerily quiet. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her back turned as she wiped down the surface. Jason and Sarah slid into a booth near the window, the vinyl seats creaking under their weight. "What'll it be?" the waitress asked without turning around. Her voice was flat, almost robotic. Jason glanced at Sarah, then back at the waitress. "Just coffee." And some toast. The waitress nodded and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving them alone in the empty diner. The silence pressed in around them, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. Sarah opened the journal, flipping through its pages. Most of the entries were now illegible, the ink smeared and faded as though the destruction of the orb had erased part of its history. One page, however, remained intact. At the top, a single sentence was scrawled in bold, jagged letters. "The engine's debt is never paid in full." She swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she turned the page. Below the ominous message was a crude drawing of the RV, surrounded by shadowy figures. In the driver's seat sat a faceless figure, its hands gripping the wheel. "Jason," she whispered, sliding the journal toward him. "Look at this." Jason frowned as he studied the page. "What does it mean?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted an answer. Before Sarah could respond, the waitress returned, setting down their coffee and toast without a word. Her face was pale and expressionless, her eyes blank as she stared at them for a moment too long. Then she turned and walked away, her footsteps silent. As they ate in tense silence, a low, rhythmic hum began to fill the diner. Jason froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. "It's the same sound," she said. "From the factory." The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor and rattling the windows. Jason stood abruptly, grabbing Sarah's hand. "We need to go," he said, pulling her toward the door. But as they stepped outside, the parking lot was no longer empty. Shadows gathered around the RV, their forms more defined than before. Their glowing eyes fixed on Jason and Sarah, unblinking. "They're back," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Jason tightened his grip on her hand. "Get in the RV. Now." The couple scrambled into the RV, slamming the door shut just as the shadows reached them. The engine roared to life on its own, and the vehicle lurched forward, tearing out of the lot and onto the highway. The shadows followed, their forms slithering across the asphalt like living smoke. "Jason, what's happening?" Sarah cried, clutching the dashboard. "I don't know," he shouted, his hands gripping the wheel even though the RV seemed to be steering itself. "I thought we ended this." The radio crackled, the distorted voice returning. "The road never ends." As the RV raced down the highway, the GPS flickered, displaying a new message. "Pay your debt." Sarah stared at the screen, her mind racing. "What debt?" she shouted. "We destroyed the engine. We broke the connection." The voice on the radio replied, its tone cold and final. "The engine is eternal. You are merely its passengers." Jason's face paled. "It's not over," he said. "It's never going to be over." The RV's speed increased, the world outside blurring into a surreal landscape of shadows and light. The road twisted and looped, leading them back to the same diner, the same parking lot, over and over again. Sarah clutched the journal, her hands shaking. "We're trapped," she said, her voice breaking. "We're stuck in its loop." Jason glanced at her, determination hardening his features. "Then we break the loop," he said. "No matter what it takes." As the RV approached the diner for the third time, Jason slammed the wheel, forcing the vehicle off the road and into the forest. Trees whipped past the windows as the RV tore through the underbrush, its engine screaming in protest. The RV came to a sudden stop in a clearing, its headlights flickering before shutting off completely. Jason and Sarah sat in silence, their breaths heavy and uneven. The radio crackled one final time, the voice now barely a whisper. "For now." Jason turned to Sarah, his expression grim. "We're not free," he said. "Not really." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "But we're alive," she said. "That has to count for something." The two of them stepped out of the RV, the forest around them eerily silent. As they walked away, the vehicle's lights flickered back on, and the faint hum of the engine filled the air once more. Weeks later, Jason and Sarah sat in their small apartment, the journal locked away in a drawer. They had sold the RV to a salvage yard, hoping to leave its curse behind. But one evening, as Sarah flipped through the channels on their TV, the screen went dark. The familiar hum filled the room, and a single message appeared. "We will find you.